The winter wind cut through the settlement of Cedar Ridge like a razor, carrying with it the promise of another harsh frontier night. 8-year-old Emma May Sullivan pulled her worn woolen coat tighter around her small frame as she hurried down the dusty main street, her bare feet dancing across the frozen ground. The year was 1887, and life in the Wyoming Territory had never been kind to those who couldn't afford proper shoes. Emma May was different from the other children in town. While they played with store-bought toys and wore dresses that fit properly, she made do with hand-me-downs and imagination. Her father had died in a mining accident 2 years prior, leaving her mother, Sarah, to work double shifts at the town's only boarding house just to keep food on their table. But Emma May possessed something that money couldn't buy: a heart so pure and generous that it seemed to glow like candlelight in the darkness of their struggling world. As she rounded the corner near the old trading post, Emma May stopped dead in her tracks. There, hunched against the wooden wall, sat an elderly Native American woman. Her weathered face was etched with lines that spoke of countless winters, and her thin shawl provided little protection against the biting cold. The woman's lips were tinged blue, and her hands shook as she tried to pull her inadequate covering closer to her frail body. Without hesitation, Emma May approached the stranger. The townspeople had always warned the children to stay away from the local tribes, filling their heads with stories of danger and mistrust. But all Emma May saw was someone who needed help. "Ma'am," Emma May's voice was soft, barely audible above the howling wind. "Are you cold?" The elderly woman looked up, her dark eyes meeting the child's clear blue ones. Despite the language barrier, something passed between them, an understanding that transcended words. Emma May began to remove her coat, the only warm thing she owned. The woman shook her head vigorously, speaking rapidly in her native tongue, clearly protesting the child's intended sacrifice. "Please," Emma May whispered, draping the coat around the woman's shoulders. "My mama always says we should take care of each other. That's what makes us human." The elderly woman's eyes filled with tears as she felt the warmth of the small coat envelop her. She reached out with a trembling hand and touched Emma May's cheek, speaking a single word in English: "Granddaughter." Emma May smiled, not understanding the full weight of what had just occurred, and skipped away into the night, her teeth chattering but her heart warm with the knowledge that she had done something good. What Emma May didn't know was that the woman she had helped was White Moon, the most respected elder of the Shoshone tribe that lived in the mountains above Cedar Ridge. White Moon was not just any tribal member. She was the grandmother of Chief Rising Eagle, a man whose very name could make the bravest cowboys tremble. But White Moon was also the keeper of an even more precious secret, one that would change Emma May's life forever. 20-3 years earlier, on an autumn day, painted gold with falling leaves, a young cavalry officer named Lieutenant James Sullivan had been separated from his unit during a scouting mission. Lost in the wilderness and wounded by a mountain lion, he had stumbled into a Shoshone camp, half dead and delirious with fever. It was there that he met Singing Bird, White Moon's daughter, woman whose beauty was matched only by her kind heart. Despite the protests of some tribal members, Singing Bird had nursed James back to health, and during those long weeks of recovery, an impossible love had bloomed between them. Their love was forbidden by both worlds. James faced court-martial. If discovered fraternizing with the enemy, while Singing Bird risked banishment from her people for consorting with a white soldier, yet love, as it often does, found a way. They met in secret for months, their hearts growing closer with each stolen moment. Singing Bird taught James the language of her people while he shared stories of the world beyond the mountains. They spoke of running away together, of finding a place where the color of their skin wouldn't matter, where their love could exist without fear or shame. But fate, cruel and unforgiving, had other plans. One crisp morning, James arrived at their secret meeting place to find Singing Bird waiting with tears streaming down her face. She pressed a small beaded necklace into his hands, the only thing of value she owned. "I carry your child," she whispered in her careful English. "My father knows. The council has decided. I must marry Strong Bear, the warrior from the eastern tribe, or face exile." James felt his world collapse. "Run away with me," he pleaded. "We'll go to California or Oregon, somewhere they'll never find us. Singing Bird shook her head, her heart breaking with each word. You don't understand. If I leave, they will hunt us both. They will kill you and take me back. Our child will grow up knowing its father died for love that could never be. Then I'll take you by force, James said desperately. And start a war? Singing Bird's voice was barely a whisper. How many will die for our happiness? How many mothers will lose their sons? How many children will grow up without fathers? They held each other as the sun set, both knowing it would be the last time. The next morning, James received orders transferring him to a fort in Colorado. He never knew that Singing Bird had given birth to a daughter, a little girl with her, mother's dark hair and his blue eyes. He never knew that Singing Bird had died in childbirth, her last words being his name, and he never knew that White Moon, in her grief, had taken the mixed-blood child to the town of Cedar Ridge and left her on the doorstep of a young couple named Thomas and Mary Sullivan, distant relatives of James, who had been trying for years to have a child of their own. The baby had been Emma May's mother, Sarah, as White Moon sat in the cold that winter night, wrapped in little Emma May's coat. She saw in the child's eyes the same kindness that had driven her daughter Singing Bird to love a white soldier. She saw the same blue eyes that had haunted her dreams for over 2 decades. This child was her great-granddaughter, the product of a love story that had ended in tragedy, but had somehow produced something beautiful, a little girl whose heart was large enough to encompass both worlds. White Moon made a decision that night, one that would ripple through both communities like stones thrown into still water. The next morning, Chief Rising Eagle rode into Cedar Ridge with a full war party. The townspeople scattered, women grabbed their children, and men reached for their guns. But the warriors came in peace, their weapons sheathed, their faces solemn rather than fierce. They stopped in front of the boarding house, where Sarah Sullivan worked. Sarah emerged, pale and frightened, with little Emma May hiding behind her skirts. Chief Rising Eagle dismounted and walked forward. He was a man of impressive stature, his presence commanding respect even from his enemies. But when he knelt before Emma May, his voice was gentle. "Little one," he said in careful English, "you gave warmth to my grandmother when she had none. You showed kindness when others would have shown fear. The Shoshone people do not forget such acts." He gestured to his warriors, who began unloading their pack horses. They carried blankets woven with intricate patterns, dried meat that would last through the winter, warm furs, and leather boots small enough for a child's feet. But the greatest gift was yet to come. White Moon stepped forward, her aged hands trembling as she held an object wrapped in soft deerskin. She unwrapped it slowly, revealing a necklace of turquoise and silver beads, the same necklace that Singing Bird had given to James Sullivan all those years ago. Sarah gasped, her hand flying to her throat. She recognized the necklace from a faded photograph she kept hidden in her jewelry box, a photograph of her birth mother that Thomas Sullivan had kept secret. Not knowing how to explain to his adopted daughter that she was the child of 2 worlds, "This belonged to your grandmother," White Moon said to Emma May, her voice thick with emotion. "She was Singing Bird, daughter of the wind, keeper of my heart. She loved a soldier named James, and from their love came your mother." Sarah stepped forward, tears streaming down her face. "I've always wondered," she whispered. "I always felt like there was something missing, some part of me that I couldn't understand." White Moon looked at Sarah with eyes that held decades of grief and love. "You have your mother's spirit and your father's eyes. And this child," she placed her hand on Emma May's head, "she has the best of all of us." Chief Rising Eagle stood and addressed the growing crowd of townspeople who had gathered to witness this unprecedented event. "For too long, our peoples have lived in fear of each other," he announced, his voice carrying across the cold morning air. "We have let old wounds fester, let misunderstanding breed hatred. But this child has shown us something we had forgotten, that kindness knows no color, that love recognizes no boundaries." He turned to Sarah. "Your mother, Singing Bird, died, believing that love between our peoples was impossible. But she was wrong. Love is never impossible. It only requires courage." The chief made an offer that shocked everyone present. The Shoshone would share their hunting grounds with the town during the harsh winter months. They would trade fairly, teach the settlers which plants could heal and which could harm. In return, they asked only for respect and the promise that their children and the town's children might learn from each other rather than fear each other. "This child gave my grandmother a coat," Rising Eagle said, gesturing to MMA. "In return, we give her people our protection, our knowledge, and our friendship." But the story was far from over. News of the unprecedented peace treaty spread quickly through the territory. Some celebrated it as a breakthrough that could change the relationship between settlers and Native Americans forever. Others saw it as dangerous precedent, a sign of weakness that other tribes might exploit. Among those who heard the news was a man working as a railroad supervisor in Colorado, a man whose hair had gone gray and whose heart had carried the weight of lost love for over 20 years. James Sullivan had never married after losing Singing Bird. He had thrown himself into his work, building railroads and bridges, trying to forget the woman who had taught him that love could transcend any barrier. When he heard about the peace treaty in Wyoming and the story of a little girl who had shown kindness to a Shoshone elder, something stirred in his chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced in decades. James requested a transfer to Wyoming, telling his supervisors that he wanted to help build the railroad line that would connect Cedar Ridge to the rest of the territory. But his real reason was the growing certainty in his heart that somehow, someway, Singing Bird's spirit was calling him home. He arrived in Cedar Ridge on a warm spring day, just as the wildflowers were beginning to bloom in the surrounding meadows. The town had changed dramatically in the months since the peace treaty. Children of both cultures played together in the streets. Shoshone women taught settler wives how to weave baskets, and the men shared hunting techniques and stories around evening fires. James was walking down the main street, marveling at the transformation. When he saw her, Sarah was hanging laundry behind the boarding house, her dark hair catching the sunlight, her profile achingly familiar. For a moment, James thought he was seeing a ghost. She looked so much like Singing Bird that his breath caught in his throat. But then Sarah turned, and James saw his own blue eyes looking back at him. The recognition was instantaneous and overwhelming. James staggered backward, his mind reeling with the implications. Sarah dropped the sheet she had been hanging and pressed her hand to her heart, feeling a connection she couldn't explain but somehow understood. "Sir," she called out hesitantly. "Are you all right?" James couldn't speak. He couldn't breathe. This beautiful woman, this mother with kind eyes and gentle hands, was his daughter. The child he had never known existed. The living proof of a love he thought had died with Singing Bird. Emma May chose that moment to come running around the corner, her arms full of wildflowers and her laughter ringing like bells in the warm air. "Mama," she called, "look what Rising Eagle's son taught me to find. He says these ones can heal cuts, and these ones make the best tea." She stopped when she saw the strange man standing in their yard, staring at her mother with tears streaming down his weathered face. "Mama," Emma May's voice was uncertain. "Who is this man?" Sarah looked from her daughter to the stranger, her heart somehow knowing the answer before her mind could process it. "I think," she said softly, "he might be your grandfather." The reunion that followed was both heartbreaking and healing. James told Sarah about her mother, about their impossible love and the circumstances that had torn them apart. He spoke of Singing Bird's courage, her kindness, and the sacrifice she had made to protect those she loved. Sarah shared her childhood with the Sullivans, the loving adoptive parents who had given her everything they could, while always wondering about the beautiful baby who had appeared on their doorstep. She told him about losing her husband in the mines, about struggling to raise Emma May alone, about the constant fear that she wasn't enough. But most importantly, they talked about Emma Matha, a remarkable little girl whose act of kindness had set in motion events that would reunite a family torn apart by prejudice and fear. "She is Singing Bird's heart," James said. "Got watching his granddaughter teach a group of children how to braid grass into tiny baskets. And her courage, too." "She has your eyes," Sarah replied, "and your stubbornness." She insisted on giving that coat away, even though it was the only warm thing she owned. White Moon, now a regular visitor to the Sullivan home, smiled as she watched the reunion unfold. The spirits work in mysterious ways, she told them. What seemed like an ending was really a beginning. James made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. He resigned from the railroad and used his savings to buy a small farm just outside Cedar Ridge. He wanted to be close to his newfound family, to help raise the granddaughter he had never expected to have, and to honor the memory of the woman who had loved him enough to let him go. But the story of healing was not yet complete. As autumn painted the mountainsides in brilliant reds and golds, Cedar Ridge prepared for its first joint harvest festival, celebration that would bring together settler and Shoshone families to share food, stories, and friendship. Emma May, now 9 years old and growing more beautiful with each passing day, had become something of a bridge between the two communities. She spoke both English and enough Shoshone to get by. She knew which berries were safe to eat and which plants could heal a fever. And she had friends in both worlds. It was Emma May who suggested that the Harvest Festival should include a ceremony to honor those who had been lost, the soldiers and warriors who had died in conflicts, the women who had passed in childbirth, the children who had been taken by disease or accident. If we remember them together, she said with the wisdom of someone far older than her years, maybe their spirits can rest in peace. The ceremony was held at sunset on a hill overlooking both the town and the tribal lands. Families from both communities gathered in a circle, each carrying a candle or torch. They spoke the names of their lost loved ones, shared memories, and offered prayers in both languages. When it came time for James to speak, he walked to the center of the circle and looked up at the stars just beginning to appear in the darkening sky. "I want to remember Singing Bird," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. She was a daughter of the Shoshone, a woman of great courage and kindness. She taught me that love can exist between any two hearts willing to embrace it. She died giving life to my daughter, and through that daughter, she gave me the greatest gift I've ever received, my granddaughter Emma May. He turned to look at White Moon, who stood with tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "I want to thank White Moon for keeping our family's story alive, for recognizing the love in Emma May's heart, and for having the courage to bridge our two worlds." As the ceremony concluded and the families began to make their way home, James found himself walking beside White Moon. They moved slowly, to elders who had carried grief for far too long. "Do you think she knows?" James asked quietly. "Do you think Singing Bird knows that her sacrifice led to this?" White Moon smiled, her face peaceful in the flickering torchlight. "Love never truly dies," she said. "It just changes form." Singing Bird's love lives on in Sarah's kindness, in Emma May's generous heart, in the peace between our peoples. She knows. As if summoned by their conversation, Emma May came running up the hill, her face flushed with excitement. "Grandpa James? Grandmother White Moon?" she called, using the names she had given to these two people who had become so precious to her. "Come see. The children want to sing the lullaby you taught me, the one in both languages." She grabbed their hands and pulled them back toward the celebration, where children from both communities had gathered around the central fire. Their voices rose together in a melody that wove English and Shoshone words into something new and beautiful, a song that belonged to both cultures and yet transcended them both. James felt his heart swell with a happiness he hadn't known was possible. This was what Singing Bird had dreamed of, a world where their love could exist without shame, where their descendants could walk freely between both worlds, where children could sing songs in languages that had once been separated by fear and misunderstanding. As winter settled over Cedar Ridge once again, James found himself thinking about the incredible journey that had brought his family together. It had started with a little girl's act of kindness, a simple gesture that had cost her nothing more than a worn woolen coat, but had given her everything in return. Emma May was thriving. She spent her mornings helping her mother at the boarding house, her afternoons learning traditional crafts from White Moon and the other Shoshone women, and her evenings listening to James tell stories about the places he had been and the things he had seen. But most importantly, she was growing up knowing that she belonged to both worlds, that she carried within herself the heritage of settlers who would come seeking a better life. in Native Americans who had lived on this land for countless generations. Sarah had found love again. 2. Dr. Michael Westbrook had come to Cedar Ridge to establish the town's first proper medical practice. Drawn by stories of the remarkable peace treaty and the opportunity to serve both communities, he was a kind, gentle man who respected Sarah's heritage and adored MMA. Their wedding was planned for the following spring, a celebration that would include traditions from both cultures. One snowy evening, as James sat by the fire in his small farmhouse, Emma May curled up beside him with a book of stories. "Grandpa," she said, looking up at him with those clear blue eyes that reminded him so much of Singing Bird, "do you think Mama Singing Bird would be proud of us?" James smiled, stroking his granddaughter's dark hair. "I think she would be amazed," he said. "I think she would look at our family, at this town, at the friendship between our peoples, and she would say that love really can conquer anything." "Even fear?" Emma May asked. "Especially fear," James replied. "Fear makes us build walls, but love tears them down. You proved that the night you gave your coat to Grandmother White Moon. You saw someone who needed help, and you didn't think about whether she looked different from you or spoke a different language. You just saw someone cold, and you made her warm." Emma May nodded solemnly. "Mama says that's what love is, making someone else warm when they're cold, whether it's cold outside or cold in their heart." As the fire crackled and the snow fell gently outside the windows, James held his granddaughter close and thought about the woman who had made all of this possible, Singing Bird, whose love had been powerful enough to bridge two worlds and whose legacy lived on in the heart of a little girl who had given her coat to a stranger. The story that had begun with separation and heartbreak had found its way to redemption and healing. Love, as it always does when given the chance, had found a way to triumph over fear, prejudice, and the barriers that divide us. And somewhere in the mountain winds that sang through the pine trees, James could swear he heard the echo of Singing Bird's laughter, joyful and free at last. Epilogue years later. When Emma May had grown into a beautiful young woman in Cedar Ridge had become known throughout the territory as a model of peaceful coexistence between cultures. People would still tell the story of the 8-year-old girl who gave her coat to a cold elder. They would speak of White Moon's wisdom in recognizing that kindness transcends all boundaries, of Chief Rising Eagle's courage in choosing peace over conflict, and of James Sullivan's long journey home to the family he never knew he had. But most of all, they would remember that sometimes the smallest acts of love can change the world, that a child's generous heart can heal wounds that have festered for generations, and that hope, like wildflowers, can bloom in even the harshest conditions. Emma May never forgot the lesson she learned that cold winter night, that we are all connected, that love knows no boundaries, and that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply offer warmth to someone who needs it. The woolen coat was carefully preserved by White Moon and eventually passed down through the generations, along with the story of the little girl whose kindness brought two worlds together. It became a symbol of hope, a reminder that love, when given freely and without condition, has the power to transform not just individual lives, but entire communities. And in the end, perhaps that is the greatest legacy of all, not the peace treaty or the prosperity that followed, but the simple truth that Singing Bird's love, carried forward through her daughter and granddaughter, had finally found the home it had always been seeking, under the endless western sky, where the wind still sings through the mountains and the wildflowers still bloom each spring. The story continues, a testament to the power of love, the possibility of redemption, and the truth that sometimes the smallest gestures can create the most profound change. The coat may have been small, worn, and humble, but the love it represented was vast enough to encompass two worlds and strong enough to heal wounds that had lasted for generations. And that, as they say in the stories of the Old West, is how love always wins in the end.